On January the 5th, 1943, a single artillery shell changed the course of World War II, without anyone even knowing why. Enemy planes exploded out of nowhere, ships survived attacks that should have sunk them, and a secret weapon did it all. This is the story of the proximity fuse, the device so advanced, the Japanese and Germans never even understood it existed. In the deadliest war humanity had ever faced, the skies became a graveyard. Each day, fleets of bombers darkened the clouds, and anti-aircraft gunners below unleashed storms of fire, mostly in vain. Thousands of shells, millions of rounds, and almost all of them missed. Victory depended not just on bravery, but on precision. And then, out of the shadows, came a secret so advanced, so unbelievable for its time, that it would change the course of World War II. It was called the proximity fuse, a tiny electronic brain that could think fast enough to decide when to explode. But behind its brilliance lay secrecy, desperation, and a race against extinction. Because if this secret fell into enemy hands, it could destroy the very nations that built it. The problem. Before the fuse. By 1941, the world was at war on every front, land, sea, and air. And in the air, the Allies were losing ground. Anti-aircraft guns relied on time fuses, mechanical devices that detonated shells after a set number of seconds. The problem? A fraction of a second too early or too late, and the shell exploded harmlessly in open air. Even expert gunners could only guess the right timing. The odds of hitting a moving plane were abysmal, less than 1 in 1,000 shots. For the US Navy, it was even worse. Japanese aircraft, especially in the Pacific, attacked in fast, low, and unpredictable waves. The infamous kamikaze dives would claim thousands of lives and ships. Something had to change. A single innovation, even a small one, could turn the tide of the war. And then, in secret laboratories and university basements, an idea began to take shape, one that seemed more science fiction than science fact. The birth of a secret idea. It started as a whisper among physicists. What if a shell could sense its target? What if it could know when it was close enough to explode without relying on a timer? The concept was bold and nearly impossible. It would require a tiny radio transmitter inside every artillery shell, something small enough to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a cannon, yet smart enough to detect the echo of its own signal when an enemy plane passed nearby. In 1940, this idea reached the newly formed Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, the US government's secret science division. At the center of it was a man named Merle Tuve, a brilliant yet unconventional physicist from the Carnegie Institution. Tuve wasn't a weapons expert, but he was known for making impossible things happen. He gathered a small team of scientists, engineers, and technicians, people who didn't think like soldiers, but like dreamers. Their mission was simple on paper: create a fuse that could think. In reality, it was one of the most difficult engineering challenges ever attempted. The team faced problems no one had solved before. Vacuum tubes, the heart of early electronics, shattered under the extreme shock of being fired from a gun. Circuits failed from vibration, heat, or acceleration. Every test ended in failure. But the stakes were too high to stop. Every time another Allied ship was sunk in the Pacific, every time bombers returned half-destroyed, the message was clear: the world needed this invention. And deep in those secret labs, something extraordinary was beginning to happen. The race against time. Every hour counted. Every day that passed meant more Allied ships sunk, more soldiers lost, more skies dominated by the enemy. Merle Tuver's team at the Applied Physics Laboratory worked in total secrecy. No headlines, no public credit. Not even the military knew the full scope of what they were doing. And yet, they were rewriting the rules of modern warfare. To make the proximity fuse a reality, they had to do something unthinkable. Build an electronic brain small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, and tough enough to survive being fired from a naval gun at over 20,000 Gs of force. They called it the VT fuse, short for variable time. But there was nothing variable about their schedule. World War II wasn't waiting for science to catch up. Failures mounted. Each test destroyed another prototype. And the military was running out of patience. The hidden heroes. While Tuve led the design, hundreds of unsung heroes across America worked in silence to make it real. Women filled assembly lines, soldering miniature circuits by hand under magnifying lenses. Factory workers tested components without knowing what they were for, only that it might help end the war. In one secret plant, workers would later recall that they had no idea they were building one of the most powerful weapons of the 20th century. But the scientists knew, and they also knew the risks. If a shell with a live proximity fuse were captured by the enemy, the Axis powers could reverse engineer the design and use it against the Allies. So Tuve made a bold decision. The fuse would only be used over water. That way, if a shell missed, it would fall into the ocean, and the secret would remain hidden. Into combat. By late 1942, the first working prototypes were ready. They were tested under extreme conditions: heat, cold, vibration, shock. Every scenario imaginable. Finally, they were mounted onto real shells aboard US Navy ships in the Pacific. The moment came in January 1943, near Guadalcanal. A formation of Japanese bombers appeared on radar. The gunners loaded the new rounds, armed with the proximity fuse, and waited. The first volley exploded near the planes, not randomly, but right beside them. The sky lit up in a chain of perfect detonations. Within seconds, several bombers dropped from the clouds, spiraling into the sea. For the first time, anti-aircraft fire was accurate. The sailors couldn't believe their eyes. What had once been a desperate guessing game was now a precise science. Word spread through the Navy. Quietly, secretly, commanders called it the greatest miracle of the war. From that day forward, the VT fuse became one of the most closely guarded secrets in military history. Each shell cost more than $100 to make, a fortune at the time, but its effectiveness was beyond measure. It turned the skies from a place of fear into a zone of control. Enemy pilots began calling the American flak magic shells. They had no idea that inside each one was a tiny machine that could sense them and decide their fate. But this was only the beginning, because as the Allies prepared for one of the largest invasions in history, the fate of the fuse would soon determine the outcome of an entire war. Turning the tide. It was now 1944. The world stood on the edge of history. The Allies were preparing for D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Across the English Channel, the beaches of Normandy waited. But so did thousands of German aircraft, poised to strike the invasion fleet the moment it was spotted. If the Luftwaffe succeeded, D-Day could end in disaster before it even began. That's when the secret of the VT fuse came into play. US and British forces quietly loaded artillery shells armed with the new technology. As the invasion began, the skies above the beaches filled with aircraft, and the air exploded with invisible precision. Every shell that came near an enemy plane detonated perfectly. Within minutes, Allied anti-aircraft fire created a shield that the Luftwaffe simply couldn't break. By the end of D-Day, the number of planes lost to anti-aircraft fire stunned military commanders. The VT fuse had done something no weapon had ever achieved before. It made the sky itself intelligent. The secret revealed. For months after D-Day, the proximity fuse remained one of the Allies' most closely guarded technologies. Its existence was known only to a select few. Even many soldiers who used it didn't fully understand what was inside those shells, only that they worked with almost supernatural accuracy. Then came the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Nazi Germany's final massive counterattack in the Ardennes. The weather was freezing, the skies thick with snow, and the Allies were caught off guard. But when German troops massed in the forests, Allied artillery unleashed something new. They loaded VT-fused shells and fired, not at tanks or trenches, but into the air above enemy formations. Each shell exploded at the perfect height, raining deadly fragments down with devastating precision. German soldiers later described it as fire from heaven. It shattered their offensive momentum and marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's army. When the battle was over, even General George S. Patton, never one for exaggeration, called the proximity fuse the greatest invention of the war. Legacy, modern impact. When peace finally returned in 1945, the full story of the proximity fuse was revealed to the world. What had once been a top-secret experiment was now recognized as one of the most important technological breakthroughs of the 20th century. It paved the way for every form of smart weaponry that would follow, from radar-guided missiles to precision bombs and even modern drones. In a sense, the proximity fuse was the first smart weapon, a tiny electronic brain that could make a split-second decision on its own, and its influence didn't stop at warfare. The same principles of miniaturized electronics, durable design, and signal detection would go on to shape early space technology, satellite systems, and advanced sensors used in everything from navigation to medicine. The fuse that once decided the fate of nations had quietly helped build the foundation of the modern technological world. Closing reflection. History rarely remembers the small things that changed everything. The proximity fuse was no larger than a light bulb, but it altered the destiny of millions. It was a triumph, born not from power or destruction, but from human ingenuity, from the minds of scientists and workers who dared to think differently, even in the darkest times. As one historian later wrote, the proximity fuse didn't just help win the war, it helped define the world that came after it. And somewhere, in the echo of every radar ping, every smart sensor, every guided system, you can still hear the heartbeat of that tiny, brilliant device that changed history.